Well, we're back. I couldn't help myself. We will have to get to the Mount Trashmore episode a little bit later because I made the mistake of opening up one of my American style cities and placing down a few of the Dutch apartment buildings. And then I realized, oh my goodness, they do mesh incredibly well with the North American vibe. A lot of it has to do with the fact that we get a bunch of corner pieces, the recoloring options, and additionally, just the quality of detail and the attention to detail on the sides of the buildings. So they tessellate really well with the Eastern Coast pack, the East Coast pack, and the Southwest slash West Coast pack of creator buildings that we got in those mod packs. They are just excellent. This city, much like the European one displayed in the previous video, also uses other asset packs. So we've got Japanese buildings right dead center of the screen at the moment, but there's also some UK buildings, so on and so forth. Whatever pretty much fits sort of the aesthetic. And again, it does show that these buildings work really well together. The Japanese buildings have kind of this nice utilitarian look. I know they're not everybody's favorite, but if you give them a little bit of love or just put them with like buildings, they tend to look fantastic. There's a hospital in this city, which is the Japanese hospital, and it looks like something you would find in the middle of Missouri. The Dutch buildings are really quite versatile. So we have some in the city in the downtown core, in the middle density, and in the lower density, kind of like the European city. I decided to try and see how far I can stretch it to make them fit in different sort of zoned areas, even if they're not zoned in game terms. So here we have kind of a medium density area. We're starting to leave the small downtown core and head into the more residential area. So you have one of those subsidized housing blocks found in the Dutch pack, just rotated 4 times, recolored for the kind of brick that you might find in the sort of Mississippi Basin area. And boom, there it is. There are also those buildings just in the background behind it, those small or maybe 3-story brick buildings. Those are also from the apartments in the Dutch pack. They look pretty good as stand-ins for either like 1980s or all the way like some of them look kind of like 50s era or pre-50s era public housing, or just brick based housing. They look good apart or together. That was kind of stretching them because they don't have windows on the side. So you've got to be kind of imaginative when it comes to covering up the sides of those buildings because they are very flat, they're very plain. Typically, a building would have windows or just something there, windows, fire escapes, doors. It's possible if you use props, you can make them look even better. But I, alas, am lazy and just thought of that literally now while I'm recording. So 10 out of 10. Maybe I'll give that a shot at some point. But either way, medium density there. It looks pretty good. Let's move merrily along to the time lapse section where we're putting some of this stuff together. Here I'm looking through those corner pieces, trying to figure out what works for the downtown core and then into the mid rise area of the medium density parts of the city. These things look so good. You can snap them together and it looks natural if they are, eating up a whole corner on their own with two 90-degree buildings, apartments sitting next to each other. Still looks natural. You can also sit them on their own, and they give the sort of impact of an area which was built up, which no longer is. So if you're modeling an American city that has been absolutely brutalized by highways and pavement and parking, these buildings are honestly ideal. If you have like one corner building standing in a huge plot, it looks really cool if it's surrounded by parking. And that, unfortunately, if you go to a lot of American cities, look at them on Google Earth for a little while, especially ones which don't really have sort of the capacity to rebuild or desire to rebuild. You will find those. They will sit there and it will look sad. But it is definitely an aesthetic. It gives a story. It tells a story relatively easily. So I was just looking for buildings that kind of tell that story. Not all of the Dutch buildings mesh quite as well. You saw me flipping through buildings. One of the ones I do use that I'm not totally convinced by for the North American sort of standpoint is those apartment buildings with the balconies in the back. They are gorgeous. They look incredible in any European city. Unfortunately, in North America, really nice, sort of lush, built up balconies like that are much less common. I think there's still wiggle room for applying them, but we might imagine that they are later additions. So something from the 2000s or late 90s. In the course of making this video, I lost a ton of footage just because of the program that I choose to use for generating these videos is both free, which is great, but also just sort of crashes randomly, and therefore I lose, usually 30-minute blocks or 20-minute blocks of footage. So, that's great. And it means that I lost a lot of the footage of me working on those medium density buildings. So a lot of this is going to be space filling in the time lapse, and also working on the low density housing and trying to fit that in, which was quite a challenge because the low density stuff in the Dutch pack, it really does. It looks European. It looks very European. But I think it is also, it has a lot of opportunity for representing small duplexes that can be found in North America, especially the models with the dormers on one side. And if you put two together, as I'm going to in the time lapse, and then make a little sort of micro community out of them, or just a single block, they tend to look quite good. Later on, I recolored them and they fit even better. So that might show up in a future video. But for the moment, I keep them in the default colors. So a lot of this, though, is just, moving power lines around, adding all of those wonderful aspects of North American infrastructure that just make things, in practical terms, worse, but does give it that feel. So we're working on a lot of parking lots. We're working on a lot of garbage cans, things like that, just to fill in the empty space between buildings, of which there's a lot of empty space between buildings in American cities. So it's excellent opportunity to create little vignettes. So this block we're working on here, it has at its corner a Dutch building, and then directly adjacent to that is another normal Dutch apartment block that is not a corner piece, and the two just tessellate perfectly together. And then to the right of those two is this gray building, these two gray buildings, which are not from the Dutch pack, and they have some commercial interests inside. And so just to their rear is the area where the trucks come to drop off goods and hang out. So the idea here is that some of these trailers are left to be unloaded overnight or whatever sort of, good neighbor rules you've got around here. And then there's a truck sitting there ready to leave. None of this, of course, is functional in the back, but it gives it a different little lived in sense that isn't as easy to attain with using the in-game mechanics. So I'm a fan of hybrid cities, which have both a mechanically functioning city and also little vignettes all over the place, just to give that extra appearance of being a living city. And here I'm putting in probably one of my absolute favorite buildings just in the game to begin with. It is this wonderful subsidized Dutch housing. It is so good. These are the corner pieces from that, mated together in a group of 4. Again, they're recolorable. They fit perfectly into these blocks. These blocks here are based on the street grid in Joplin, Missouri, and it fits perfectly in there. Add some parking. It looks almost like a dorm for a university or a college. It can also be, medium rent or lower rent, built in the 80s. It just looks gorgeous. We'll come back to it later. Here we've got one of those Dutch buildings, which I'm slightly less convinced by, one of those nice big apartment blocks. It does look very nice. I've put a much older sort of colonial era house just behind that lot with a really nice lush backyard. So you've got these sort of wealthy downtown family that lives directly in the back lot in the shadow of this bigger apartment building, which would also be relatively high rent. And here we're plopping down the low density residential Dutch, and we also add a couple other buildings. I like the idea of kind of hybrid blocks, having mono blocks where the whole area is just one type of building. Sometimes it's really nice. In this city, that's pretty rare. That's extremely rare. Instead, we go for some lots that weren't purchased or not sold, rather, that still retain their original owners. So either those are going to be empty lots, which is really common in a lot of American cities. You see it in Detroit quite famously. but also lots which still have their not necessarily original, but previous construction. So we get some more traditional looking North American buildings rubbing shoulders with more modern, more recent projects. So that's kind of the aesthetic we're going for here. And there's a little bit of dead space in this area as well. I love dead space. I love the ground textures you can place now that have been modded in. They make things look very alive. So you can have just a little story. You can imagine a little story in all these areas. So with the block of the low density residential, the area just behind the houses, there's just a tiny little ditch, which is just enough space to place some foliage, some of those gorgeous little ploppable water effects, like just little ponds. But if you place them in a line, you can kind of get a sort of dry stream or stream effect. And then we put in some trees and some trash, and you can just imagine it as a place where, say, like, the local, one of the 12-year-olds from that house will go into the back and imagine they're in the dark forest. So that's their little place. There is, however, a practical element to these wooded spaces, and that is that the foliage, especially like bush number two, and then most of the trees, especially the nicer ones, can be used to mask the plain walls of some of these Dutch buildings that don't have windows. These ones actually do have windows, but it's still quite plain. If you put a couple of trees in there, a viewer is not going to realize quite how bare they are, because our minds will just automatically assume, oh, there's got to be windows there. Even if we don't see them, we're going to believe they're there. There's just a tree in the way. So these trees kind of also serve that purpose. Slight changes in terrain are useful for that, and some of the taller fences as well. And boom, we are back into some time lapses, just some sort of living city shots. And yes, it is raining in City Skylines too, and that means the frame rate has tanked. I am suffering. I don't know why every time I try to record something, it decides to rain. It makes me a very sad person. But on the screen is one of the main thoroughfares of this city, tentatively named Yoplin. And in the background, you can see some of those Dutch buildings. That corner building just in the back right is one of the Dutch ones, and so is the one adjacent to it on the left. And they fit right in. You wouldn't even really know unless somebody told you. They don't have any defining aspects that make them explicitly Dutch. Not those two. Some of them do have the little hazebalk, butchering that pronunciation, but the moving beam or pole that sits out above the top window typically, those are characteristically Dutch, and you just kind of have to live with them because you do not find those in the US or Canada. But they're pretty small. Again, from a distance, you're not going to be able to see them, and also not all buildings have them. A lot of the more dense buildings do not have them at all, and neither does the beautiful subsidized apartment block. Here we're working on the low density area and adding some layers to the apartment buildings lot. One of the sort of major components to making a place look a little more authentic is just layering on weathering effects, basically, just like painting a model or something like that. We're adding cracks, we're adding tire marks, we're adding wet marks, we're adding different types of grass, different types of ground cover, flowers. And then on top of the houses, we're going to add some of those nice, dark, ploppable decals, which just add a really great weathered effect to the roofs and make everything look extra lived in. As you can see, we've also recolored most of the houses in that block, the Dutch ones. So while they actually have less of the kind of red brick look, they have this kind of, I don't know, 80s vibe going with that lighter brick, or maybe early 90s. So we can imagine that this area was redeveloped into this particular lot for whatever reason, but the city or the developer wasn't able to acquire the entire block. So one of these little shops, maybe like a hardware store or something, is residing on the lot alongside the houses. I love the effect of little patches of flowers in the yards, dandelions, things like that, which like to just sort of pop up even after all the lawn has been mowed. Then we zoom out a little bit and we can sort of see the impact of three different types of these Dutch buildings in close proximity in this area. You've got the low density, you've got the subsidized, and you have those nice little apartment buildings. Those, the ones on the left, would have been added later, much later. And they're abutting actually part of a school, part of a high school, which resides on both sides of that road. And yeah, you can see that these things fit in. It looks kind of like a North American city, just with only really here a minority of dedicated North American assets. The majority on that in that shot are Dutch, but they fit right in. One of the defining aspects of some of these Dutch buildings that's worth mentioning is that they do not come with parking attached, like a driveway or whatever. So this is a situation where using the Move It tool, dragging the buildings off of the road a little bit, and then taking advantage of their little pathways and then plopping prop cars might be a useful way to mask the fact that these don't have functional driveways. Ultimately, though, when combined, you get this really nice, authentic kind of effect. And I really like this area here with the low density. It seems like a nice, sleepy place where you've just got a relatively close community because you still have a certain amount of density. You're still close to the urban area. There's some woods nearby. It looks like a fun place to be. At some point, we'll have to figure out how to connect it up with public transit and maybe modernize the city a little bit to repedestrianize it and provide those sort of modern amenities. Maybe even one day, pray tell, bike lanes to bring it into sort of the 21st century. But at the moment, I mean, it looks all right. And the Dutch buildings, because of their versatility, you can really represent, if you wanted to, different eras with a fair amount of intentionality that some of the default assets really, really struggle with, where they either look too cartoony, they have sort of weird textures, or they have elements that are very modern. A lot of these creator packs, and the Dutch one especially, are much better at providing you kind of a canvas to work from rather than a straight out of the box model that you plop and you'd use. You can do that. These are totally playable models. They're just very flexible. Here we've got some time lapse footage from a slightly different angle. Dead center, you've got one of those wonderful Dutch corner pieces. Yeah, just to talk about maybe the future of this city, this much like the European one, I have no real intent for. The city itself is unsurprisingly vaguely modeled off of Joplin, Missouri, but it also takes influence from towns in Oklahoma and Louisiana. I'm a huge fan of some of the fictional histories or narrative kind of cities that much better creators than myself produce. Whether or not I do anything with this town in that vein is sort of up in the air still. But I think I definitely want to do something on small local bus networks that sometimes call themselves trolleys, even though it is a bus, which is a crime against humanity. But maybe we'll get into that the next time you see Yoplin. Thanks so much for watching, and see you next time.